Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast brought to you by Bangalore International Centre, where we present conversations that move, inform, and encourage discourse.
I think a lot of the people of India often look at the tribals as people who are very different from them. Now we know for a fact that that's not true at all. The tribals are the closest relatives that the rest of the Indian population has anywhere in the world, because they share the ancestry. That's the largest ancestry they all share, which is that of the original out of Africa migrants. And that is what distinguishes actually the South Asian population from the rest of the world.
You just heard Tony Joseph on migrations that shaped the Indian demography. Tony Joseph is a journalist and editor and is one of the 3 editors of this collection. The Indians is a collection of essays by some of South Asia's foremost historians and scholars that maps the origins, evolution, and present-day reality of India's civilization and people. The collection covers a period of some 12,000 years, from the last ice age to the 21st century. The book is divided into 7 sections: the evolution of humans and their life conditions, foundations, emergence and the decline of civilization, the language mix and philosophies in ancient India, cultures, subnationalities and region, colonialism, towards federalism, social and political movements, and India since independence. This BIC Talks mini-series, Histories of a Civilization, glimpses into the collection presenting readings from selected essays interspersed with conversations with the scholar who wrote them, providing a sampling of the various topical discourses that cover the epochs of the subcontinent, and hopes to encourage our listeners to take a deep dive into what makes the Indians.
The way you describe India in terms of population emergence and population admixture gives a very different picture of prehistory than what was available to historians and archaeologists just about, say, a couple of decades ago. I would say even almost just about 6 or 7 years ago. And now this new science has come in and it is giving us a lot more information. So do you visualize a radical shift in the way history is written in future? My question is, when William Jones brought in the idea of Aryans and the Indo-European languages, the attitude to his past changed in India. So do you see this happening with the coming of your book and other books in the area in the last few years?
I think absolutely so. What has happened is that even before this, we used to have a hazy idea of how our population may have formed. But there was no way of settling differences of opinion or even what were the clear reasons for making this. So I think what was used to be a hazy picture has now become much more clearer. It fits in, and the new picture that is emerging, and this is also surprising, it is not that it has overturned significantly what we knew earlier. It has significantly enhanced the clarity of what we knew earlier with greater granularity. And I think this settles many issues and brings more nuanced understanding of how the Indian population formed over thousands of years.
So, say when Rajesh Kochar worked on the question of the Saraswati River, and he showed very competently, very completely that it is some river in the present-day Afghanistan that is being referred to in the Veda. Kochar used the Puranas as some of his supporting material. In a scientific way, of course, not from the perspective of a believer. When genetics comes in, do you think myth comes to an end? I am asking this question, Tony, because while myth died its natural death in Europe at the beginning of the 20th century, I mean, it remained alive only in literature, but for common people, myth was a thing of the past. In India, it still continues to hold a sway over the minds of a very large number of Indians. And therefore, this question acquires a special significance in the Indian context.
I think textual sources are very useful, but also difficult, because all textual sources have to be looked at from the point of view of who was it written by, for whom was it written, what was the intent of the text. Because without understanding this context, it's always difficult and easy to fall into wrong interpretations. And sometimes the problem is that unless it is supported by other evidence, whether it is archaeology, genetics, etc., by itself it would be difficult to convince anyone that this is the correct interpretation. But I think Kocha did it very well, because he used a variety of sources of information, of data, and then said this is how it all hangs together. And broadly, for the main question that he addressed of one of the major migrations into this subcontinent, we now know that has been proved significantly. And the amazing thing is that the new findings, the genetic findings, fit reasonably well with the timelines that had been worked out earlier, with some adjustments, but broadly within the timelines that had been worked out earlier, even without the genetic evidence.
Now, in the same line, I have two very important questions. These questions acquire importance in the present context in India. The first is about Manu. Now, in the ancient literature available, many Manus are mentioned, and one of them did the Manusmriti. But going by, and it all, the hagiology and the genealogies presented in those texts all seem to be not of much significance in the light of what you have described as population emergence. So, will your research and the other researches inspired by your work bring an end to the centrality that Manusmriti has in the minds of a large numbers in India?
Manusmriti falls within earlier series of Dharma Sutras and other Dharma Shastras that will follow. I mean, if the question is whether this takes away the reasoning that the Varnasrama Dharma follows from the Purusha Sukta of how the four castes come from the different arms of the Purusha. Yes, because now we know that the caste system has a definite, what shall I say, a somewhat definite period of origin. Meaning, it is not that the caste system began at an exactly, but we know that it went national around 2000 years ago, somewhere around 2000 years ago. It doesn't mean that it didn't exist at all. But if it existed, it probably existed in limited communities and limited regions. But around 2000 years ago, genetics says, endogamy began being practiced on a very wide scale. So obviously, that's not the time scale that would fit in with the time scale that is imagined of the Purusha Sukta. To that extent, yes, it takes away that myth. But on the other hand, the Manusmriti would be of huge relevance in terms of understanding how did it come about at that point of time, especially once we also know that the generally understood, as I understand it, the composition is around 150 CE, and you see it matches not, is somewhat around the time when all of this is beginning. So its relevance in a historical sense goes up, but in mythical sense, yeah, of course, it has a problem.
Okay. Well, thank you for drawing the discussion in that direction. That was my second question. That is, if our population is a mix of many migrations, mix of populations that are migrated, then the custom of endogamy, which doesn't allow population mix, they seem to be, the observations seem to be somewhat not easy to reconcile. So, as you said just now, the practice of endogamy is subsequent to the population mix. And is there any evidence in genetics of population mixes in the period following the, Christian period, that is the last 2000 years, or does genetics not get into that period at all?
I think the study that looked at this, what it came to was the conclusion that until in the early years, in the early centuries of the Common Era, there was a practice of significant mixing between population groups. And we can see that today from the surprising fact that no matter how remote a region that you go to, no matter how remote a population is from the rest of the population, it is still mixed. You will still find it a mixture of the original out of Africa migrants, the West Asia migrants who were part of the Harappan civilization, East Asia migrants. Now there might be a few groups, 8 or so far, with limited groups who do not have the steppe ancestry, but everyone else, there is significant mixing of all the population groups, which is really surprising, as I said, because no matter which part of the subcontinent that you look at, no matter what region, what religion, what level, what caste, how remote a region, this holds true, which couldn't have happened without a very long and significant period when mixing happened. And it fits in fairly well with the fact that the very early Vedic texts do not really, talk about not mixing or castes, etc. That comes in much later.
So what you're saying is the genetic signature is the first identity signature. Religion and caste and language and location are subsequent identity signatures for our population.
What I wanted to say was that, I will put the answer in two levels. One, I think a lot of the people of India often look at the tribals as people who are very different from them. Now we know for a fact that that's not true at all. The tribals are the closest relatives that the rest of the Indian population has anywhere in the world, because they share the ancestry. That's the largest ancestry they all share, which is that of the original out of Africa migrants. And that is what distinguishes actually the South Asian population from the rest of the world. And that is shared.
Well, I would agree with you. Having worked with tribals, I always thought that a tribe is an economic identity marker rather than a genetic identity marker.
To answer your earlier question, yeah. So I think the other markers of whether it is religion, caste, etc., that come on at later stages as part of the operation of history.
So now the dangers of this advantage, the advantage that genetics gives us, and that is since large-scale scientific institutions are government-controlled, and all this testing requires very close government oversight. It cannot be done as private enterprise by scientists in some private lab. The danger of the state manipulating either the data or the ability of scientists to carry out experiments and come out with observations will in the present times with very pervasive surveillance, does that danger lurk ahead of us and remind us of the times of say Nazi rule in Germany, where pseudo science was brought in for determining racial purity and features like that?
Yeah, I think these dangers lurk always, because those with a very limited minds do tend to use new discoveries along pathways that they prefer. But in the question of the government and that kind of, I think the solution lies in the fact that we are a federal structure, and the different states should have should have a role to play in this area as well. And I think some states are already beginning to play that role. And so I think histories of their own population. So I think the problems are bigger when data is controlled from a singular central point, and the problems are much less when there is a multiplicity of work happening at different levels and within the federal structure that we have.
Like Darwin's theory of evolution went to all Indian languages, became part of the school child's knowledge of the past. This new research on human population, which is in a way a subset of the larger theory of evolution. Do you think a time will come sooner or later when in Indian languages this research will be available and will change people's attitude to who they are, what their pasts have been, what their social identities really are, or given the nature of the high level scientific complexity in the field, it will remain like some kind of astrophysics, a rather difficult subject to grasp. You yourself have worked as a bridge between this new science and people's understanding, and you have made a very significant epochal contribution, I'm aware. But do you see signs of this getting into Indian languages?
It has to happen, and I'm sure it will happen. And the fact of the matter remains that population genetics is a highly complex field, and the science itself, as it is done in the papers, would make no sense to a much larger audience. But I think there is room and potential for, because this is information that is very interesting and useful to large numbers of people. So I think that need will be fulfilled, and I think there will be more books that bridge the gap. For example, it was very fast, quite apart from the fact of why the focus of my book was on how the Indian population formed, but quite apart from that, it was interesting to see from the research that you can actually understand the food preferences of Indians from the distribution of one single gene that allows adult humans to digest milk. Not all all human children can digest milk, but not all adult humans can digest milk. And those who can digest milk have to have a particular gene, and the distribution of that gene is in a particular way. It's very high in the north, and I mean it's relatively high in north and west, significantly low in the east, and relatively low in the south too. But when you look at it with the dietary preferences across the regions, it fits so well. Milk and milk-related consumptions are much higher in the north and the west, much less in the in the east and the south. Conversely, those who get much less of the protein from milk get much more of it from fish and meat. So if you want to understand the meat preferences, the dietary preferences of Indians, we usually always look at it as a cultural patterns created by culture, but that's not entirely true. It also has a role to play in the way that the genes are distributed across. So I'm saying that there are a lot of these factors that explain things in a very interesting manner and in a very illuminating manner.
There's one question which was asked every time the new book on history was discussed, and that was it came from common sense curiosity, and that question was, if it is true that our ancestral mothers are common, but our ancestral fathers have come from outside. Several ladies asked, then did those men come in without their women? How would you explain this? How would you answer such a question?
There are multiple reasons, I think. In some cases, yes, I think there is reason to think that some of the more male migrants might have come than female, and I think this holds true, especially in the case of Austroasiatic speakers, where you can see that today, if you look at their, so you can see that difference. But I think that is not the only reason why this could happen. It could also happen because of the hierarchy structures. If those males in a more powerful hierarchy have more access to mates, then they leave behind a significantly more number of progeny, which and then they therefore proportionately those others go out of the pool. So it's not merely the number of the gender composition of the migrants; it is also the structure of the power hierarchy and the way it operates that has a role to play in this.
The knowledge that Indian population is mixed, all of us belong to the same genetic range of humans, tribes and castes, in a way are a differentiation that has nothing to do with who we are, but how we have been. Given that, once this knowledge spreads, just as I said earlier, Darwin's theory of evolution spread in India in about half a century very successfully. Once your observations and the observations coming from genetics spread in India, particularly in Indian languages, do you foresee a considerable weakening of the caste system in the light of this knowledge? I mean, let me add something. The hold of religion in England and in America did not get affected the same way by Darwinism. In America, the opposition to Darwinism was stronger. In England, Darwin was accepted as their own old good chap and given a royal funeral. In India, given the deep entrenchment of the caste system, will this knowledge remain as something in the knowledge domain without affecting the society, or do you think that somehow this will considerably weaken the caste system, hold of the caste concept on people's minds?
I think this will significantly strengthen the hands of those who wish and fight for a less hierarchical order. And that, I think, is without the question. But I think we are in a situation where this is still a battle. This is still a fight. So I think, this strengthens the hands of those who wish for a more egalitarian order and a less hierarchical one in terms of human dignity and opportunities.
Well, I'm sure if Dr. Ambedkar had been around this time, he would have wholeheartedly welcomed your research for furthering his own and Gandhi too.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is that one of the points that Ambedkar was trying to make was that there are no, it's the same people. It's the same people. One group stopped for whatever reason. They did not do some of the rights and things like that. They got ostracized. They were denied this for this, or they fought, etc. But the main point of his point was that these are not racial differences. And he did not have genetics with him at that point. Even now, when you say there are people, we follow the 4 population groups are mixed. They are not mixed in the same manner. There are different regions. People in Eastern India will have more of the East Asian ancestry. People in Western India will have more of the West Asian and etc. Or people in the South will have more of the First Indian ancestry. So there are differences in proportions, but we are all formed out of the same blocks of the migrations that came in. And I think Ambedkar understood that these differences are more man-made. Yeah.
Your point is well taken. Of course, we need diversity. The process of evolution needs diversity, and diversities will remain. But the difference and the leading to discrimination is the issue, and I feel will significantly contribute to reducing that discrimination. And I hope that some enlightened legislation will be brought in future on the basis of this scientific knowledge to help people to reduce discrimination. So, may I request you to read out the first two paragraphs of your inimitable essay?
In the last one decade, our understanding of how the world got peopled and how different population groups formed has changed significantly. To a great extent, this has been due to advances made by a relatively new discipline called population genetics, which gained the ability to access and analyze DNA collected from skeletons of people who lived thousands or tens of thousands of years ago. Over the last few years, thousands of ancient human DNA samples have been recovered from all over the world, up from just 10 in 2014, giving us a far clearer picture of which population groups moved when and where to create the world as it is today. Population genetics has been around for decades, but until recently, it used to look only at the genomes of currently living population groups. And these studies could tell us which population groups were closely or weakly related to which other population groups, but they could not say how these relationships came about. And this is what changed when population geneticists acquired the ability to extract and analyze ancient DNA. For example, let us say that we have collected ancient DNA from an archaeological site in region X. And let us say, hypothetically, that from an archaeological level 4,000 years ago, we find no evidence of, say, Central ancestry, but that from a level that is 3,000 years ago, we do find such ancestry. It would then be a reasonable conclusion that Central Asian ancestry moved into region X between 4,000 and 3,000 years ago. In other words, we can now figure out which population groups moved into which parts of the world and when. Since large population movements in prehistory happened across vast swaths of territory, the new picture that we get of human movements looks like a jigsaw puzzle that is coming together, with each new ancient DNA discovery filling in a part of the puzzle and thus helping us to complete the picture. As a result, we now know that Europe went through two major periods of churn in the last 10,000 years. First, a population of farmers from West Asia, or to be specific, from Anatolia, which is today's Turkey, moved into Europe around 9,000 years ago. These newly arrived farmers from Anatolia then replaced, or to a lesser extent mixed, with the hunter-gatherers who were already living there. Then, around 5,000 years ago, yet another group of pastoralists from Central Asia, with mastery over horse and metallurgy, moved into Europe, replacing or mixing with the then existing dominant population of farmers and the still remaining smaller population of hunter-gatherers.
We also know now that the Americas saw at least 3 migrations from Asia through Siberia and the Bering Strait long before the Europeans ever set foot there, and that Southeast Asia saw at least 2 major migrations that reshaped its population. The first one spreading Austroasiatic languages across the region, and the second one Austronesian languages across the Pacific Islands and Madagascar. Putting the new genetic evidence together with earlier evidence from other disciplines such as archaeology, we can identify 4 classes of migrations in particular that played a big role in shaping world demography, each of which lasted hundreds or sometimes thousands of years. The first class of migrations began around 70,000 years ago, when a group of modern humans left the African continent and moved into the Arabian Peninsula, and then went on to people the rest of the world. The last continent they reached was the Americas, and it is likely that they got there more than 16,000 years ago. So between 70,000 years ago and over 16,000 years ago is when most of the world got populated by modern humans. And the first people who moved into all of these regions can be called out of Africa or OOA migrants. So between 70,000 years ago and over 16,000 years ago is when most of the world got populated by modern humans. And the first people who moved into all of these regions can be called out of Africa migrants.
The second class of major historic migrations happened much later, after the last glacial period ended around 12,000 years ago, when some modern human populations took to agriculture in different parts of the world. Not every group took to agriculture at the same time, and not all agriculture was equally productive or beneficial. Those who were in situations that enabled them to take up cereal cultivation, for example in Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, and China, were in a more advantageous position than, say, those who took to cultivating tubers, yams, and bananas, as in the Pacific Islands or Southeast Asia. And wherever modern humans took to cereal cultivation, what followed was a population explosion. After people settled down to farm and found ways to increase productivity, human fertility and numbers increased dramatically, leading to migrations. This set of farming-related migrations, or Neolithic migrations as they are called, left behind strong marks on human demography everywhere. The migrations from West Asia, which took farming to Europe, is one example. Migrations originating from China that spread Austronesian languages through maritime Southeast Asia, Madagascar, and the islands of the Pacific Ocean beginning around 5,000 years ago are another. The third major class of prehistoric migrations happened after some modern humans in Central Asia mastered the art of metallurgy and weaponry and wheels and wagons, and later also managed to domesticate horses well enough to use them for the kind of mobility modern humans never had before. This set of migrations affected a large part of Eurasia, from the farthest reaches of Europe to West Asia, South Asia, and China. We could perhaps call them the Bronze Age migrations. These three classes of migrations happened, by and large, in the prehistoric period or before writing had become a common practice in most parts of the world. But the fourth major class of migrations driven by historic forces took place in the last few centuries, when some modern humans figured out how to cross the vast oceans and invented steamships that helped them sail around the world quickly and create colonies. This was also global in its impact and changed the demography in major and minor ways in different parts of the world. Australia and the Americas, for example, saw their demography being fundamentally altered, while the Indian demography felt no significant impact from this particular migration because the number of colonialists who arrived here were too small relative to the population of the region. This is also true of other migrations or invasions that happened in the historical period, including that of the Greeks, the Sakas, the Parthians, the Huns, and the Arabs. To understand how India got peopled, therefore, we need to understand how the three earlier classes of migrations impacted the subcontinent. The out of Africa migration that still contributes the largest part to the DNA of the average Indian, two Neolithic migrations, one that features a population related to early farmers of Iran, that was part of the agricultural transformation in northwestern India, and the other from East Asia that brought Austroasiatic languages to India, and of course, the last major migration which came from Central Asia and brought Indo-European language speakers who called themselves Arya into India. Population genetics can today tell us the basic story of how populations formed over what period of time, but the resolution of these findings and their explanatory power increases manifold when they match well with findings from other disciplines that have looked at the same issues. For example, we know from genetics that all modern humans outside of Africa are descendants of a small group of Africans who moved into Asia around 70,000 years ago, and then spread across the world. How do geneticists know this? Because looking into the genomes of all living populations outside of Africa today, they are able to trace their ancestry back to a small subsection of the African population that existed around 70,000 years ago.
So, whether we're talking about the first Indians, first Europeans, first Chinese, first Australians, first Japanese, or first Americans, we were all descendants of the small group of out of Africa migrants. But as yet, genetics is not able to tell us about when the out of Africa migrants reached India or about their process of settlement in the subcontinent. For that, we need to turn to archaeology, which shows that the earliest modern humans were in India by at least 65,000 years ago. This is because we can see from fossils and tools that the earliest migrating modern humans left behind at various places that they were in Australia by at least 59,300 years ago and Southeast Asia by at least 63,000 years ago. If this is so, it should be reasonable to assume that they were in India by at least 65,000 years ago, since their most likely route to Southeast Asia and beyond, to East Asia and Australia, would have taken them through India. However, it is not just the question of when they reached India, but also how they settled in the subcontinent that is being answered by archaeology. For instance, archaeology informs us that when the first Indians arrived in the subcontinent, it was already well populated by archaic humans or members of other Homo species that are our evolutionary cousins. This we know from the abundant stone tools that the latter left behind, especially in central and southern India. Archaeologists believe that the new migrants from Africa would have preferred to stay out of the way of the well-established population of archaic humans, especially in peninsular India. We often believe that when modern humans arrived on the scene, they were much superior to the other Homo species. This belief is incorrect. Modern humans were not distinctly superior to archaic humans, and in fact, some archaic humans had larger brains than us. For most of the time that they shared the earth, the tools made by modern humans were indistinguishable from those made by archaic humans. So it is likely that when they arrived in the Indian subcontinent, modern humans chose not to tangle with the archaic humans and instead moved across the sub-Himalayan region with their descendants over time going on to East Asia, Australia, etc. It's also possible that another branch of the same population of modern humans took the coastal route to avoid the archaic human populations in the heart of the peninsula, traveling down the western coast all the way south to Sri Lanka and then up the eastern coast and on to Southeast Asia, etc. The earliest modern human fossils discovered in the Indian subcontinent have been from Sri Lanka, dated to around 50,000 years ago. In other words, modern humans reached different parts of the Indian subcontinent at different periods of time, and archaeologists give this settlement pattern the name Indian staged dispersal. That takes us to the next question. What was the second major migration into India, which, as we saw, was most likely related to the spread of agriculture? When did it happen, and what chain of events did it give rise to? Evidence for the first agricultural settlement in the subcontinent comes from a village called Mehergarh in the Balochistan province of today's Pakistan, dating back to around 7000 BCE. And at its earliest levels, we see a population that was beginning cultivation of wheat and barley and was domesticating animals. In the archaeological record, we can see the agricultural revolution spreading from Balochistan to Sindh to Punjab to Haryana and across the entire region of northwestern India, with villages slowly becoming fortified and developing into towns, and finally, the emergence of the Harappan cities and civilization. So who were these people that were starting up agriculture in the subcontinent, who then went on to create the Harappan civilization? Genetic studies based on ancient DNA recovered from the mature Harappan period, that is between 2600 and 1900 BCE, answer this question in 2019. The Harappans, it is now clear, were an admixed population of first Indians and a population related to early agriculturists from the Zagros mountain region of Iran, who may have been in India from some time before 8000 BCE, before there is evidence for agriculture anywhere in the world. But the full story begins emerging when you bring in archaeological evidence. The thing to keep in mind is that the genetic research that confirmed the link between Iranian populations and the Harappans was based on ancient DNA recovered from an archaeological site called Ganj Dare in the central Zagros mountains. This is the earliest site as yet with evidence of sheep and goat domestication in the world from around 7000 BCE. More importantly, this is the site that has been compared with the above mentioned Mehergarh by French archaeologist Jean-François Jarry, who excavated Mehergarh in the 1980s. In an article written in 2006, a dozen years before genetic evidence linked Ganj Dare to northwestern India, this is what he had to say. The full setting of the farming economy at Mehergarh displays evident similarities with what has been noticed in the case of the early Neolithic settlements. The full setting of the farming economy at Mehergarh displays evident similarities with what has been noticed in the case of the early Neolithic settlements in the hilly regions forming the eastern border of Mesopotamia. Here Jarij is specifically talking about sites such as Ganj Dare. What exactly are the evident similarities? The same kind of quadrangular houses built with narrow bricks about 60 centimeters long, with finger marks for keying the mortar, circular fire pits filled with burnt pebbles, suggesting the use of heated stones for cooking bread, a technique used in Balochistan even today. Traces of red paint on the walls of the structures, skeletons in burials placed in similar positions, baskets coated with bitumen, oblong cakes of red ochre, similar styles of making early ceramics. The list is so long that it can leave no doubt about the links between these early farming regions. It is no surprise then that Jarij uses the phrase cultural continuum to describe the relationship between the two regions.
The archaeological evidence thus adds flesh and blood to the story that DNA tells. It tells us of a group of modern humans related to the pioneering animal herders in the Zagros region of Iran, mixing with the first Indians who were perhaps already domesticating humped cattle and buffalo. We know from genetic research that both these animals, the zebu and the water buffalo, were domesticated in India. This mixed population then went on to spark an agricultural revolution in northwestern India and later, on that foundation, to create the Harappan civilization. When the Harappan civilization declined around 1900 BCE due to a long drought that brought down other civilizations of the time in other parts of the world as well, the Harappans moved east towards North India and south towards South India, mixing with other populations and becoming the ancestors of all Indians. The next large migration was of farmers from East Asia who brought Austro-Asiatic languages and some new farming practices to India around 4,000 years ago. This was revealed because of recent genetic studies based on extensive use of ancient DNA from all across Southeast Asia. Austro-Asiatic languages such as Mundari and Khasi are spoken by tribals in central and eastern India, and these languages are related to the Mon Khmer family of languages spoken today in Thailand, Vietnam, etc. This brings us to the last of the four major migrations that shaped Indian demography, that of the Indo-European language speakers who call themselves Arya. In 2019, the journal Science published a paper titled The Formation of Human Populations in South and Central Asia. It was co-authored by 117 leading scientists from across disciplines and geographies, including India, and it presented the most exhaustive genetic evidence for prehistoric migrations from the Central Asian steppe into India between 2000 BCE and 1500 BCE. It is said that until around 2100 BCE, there was no evidence of a Central Asian steppe ancestry in the regions on the periphery of the Harappan civilization. But after this period, we begin to see evidence of such ancestry in these regions. The study said that there was a southward migration of pastoralists from the Kazakh steppe first towards southern Central Asian regions such as Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan after 2100 BCE, and then towards South Asia between 2000 and 1500 BCE. But how do we know that this migration brought Indo-European languages, including a precursor to Sanskrit, to India? There are two kinds of evidence that genetics itself provides. One is the discovery that steppe pastoralists from Central Asia moved into Europe about 1,000 years before they moved into India. This gels with the observed geographic spread of Indo-European languages from Western Europe to the Indian subcontinent. In addition, as pointed out in the 2019 study authored by Narasimhan, the fact that traditional custodians of liturgy in Sanskrit tend to have more steppe ancestry than is predicted by the model provides an independent line of evidence for a Bronze Age steppe origin of South Asia's Indo-European languages. In a nutshell, by around 1500 BCE, all the four major components of the Indian population were in the First Indians, the West Asians, the East Asians, and the Central Asians. And what we see during the next 1500 years is genetic mixing between these populations in such a way that no Indian population group is left untouched. Today, if you analyze the DNA of any population group in India, no matter in how remote a region, you will find that it carries mixed ancestry in varying proportions. The only population group that escaped this mixing in this period probably was the Andaman Islanders, and that is only because they were cut off from the mainland. But what is remarkable is that this mixing came to an end sometime around 100 CE, when endogamy took hold. Since endogamy is a distinguishing mark of the caste system, we can surmise that it was around this time that the caste system fell into place. In other words, a full-fledged caste system may not have begun with the arrival of the Arya, as is commonly believed, but over 1500 years later. Summing up, this is one way to look at and understand the Indian population structure. Four prehistoric migrations that provided the basic components, a 1500 to 2000 year period of mixing, which ensure that almost all population groups in the country are a combination of these components in different proportions, and then a 2000-year period of genetic segregation or endogamy that has created a large number of small populations. There is also another figurative method that could help us understand the Indian population structure, the metaphor of the Indian demographic pizza, where the base is the ancestry of the first Indians and the descendants of the original out of Africa migrants. This is so because we know from genetic studies that the ancestry of the first Indians accounts for 50 to 65% of the ancestry of most Indian population groups today. Without this base, there is no Indian demographic pizza. On top of this base comes the sauce, which is Harappan ancestry. Why is this so? Because when their civilization declined due to a long drought around 1900 BCE, the Harappans moved from northwest India to North India as well as to South India, thus becoming the ancestors of today's North Indians as well as South Indians. In the north, they mixed with the new arrivals from Central Asia, and in the south, they mixed with the first Indians. Thus, in many ways, the Harappans can be seen as the cultural glue that holds Indians together, because when they moved all over India, they took with them many of the cultural practices and belief systems that they had perfected in the crucible of the Harappan civilization. And these have now become integrated into the lives and belief systems of Indians everywhere. The later migrations can then be seen as the cheese and the toppings on this demographic pizza. This roughly sums up the way in which current findings explain the structure and distribution of the Indian population. Very broadly, therefore, one can expect the eastern parts of India to carry relatively more East Asian ancestry, the northern and western parts to carry more West Eurasian ancestry, and the southern parts of India to carry comparatively more First Indian ancestry.
You have been listening to BIC Talks by Bangalore International Centre. If you like what you heard, do follow us on social media. Keep up with our programming by signing up for our mailer on the website or leave us a review or rating on Apple Podcasts or iTunes. The crew that makes these podcasts possible is Gaurav Krishna and Ishan Gupta on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Sarunaraj and Raghu Tenkaila. Artwork is designed by Chandni Venkataraman of Crisscross Design Studio. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org. This is Lekha Naidu signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.